Okay, folks, we're running slightly late now, so can I welcome you back to the third panel in this fantastic conference that's been put together, and I am in absolute awe of the technical, social, emotional, organisational, logistical skills that have been shown by all of the people involved in this. But you don't want to hear me wittering on, so I'm going to turn you over relatively quickly to Catherine, one of the driving forces behind the conference, as I've seen this morning, who is going to be talking about the great replacement theory, fascism's unifying myth. Take it away, Kath.
Just get this started. Let's get rid of Jade. Hang on, do we have video on actually? Sorry. Me fretting about tech again, even though I meant to have stopped. Just as a warning before I start, I will be discussing far-right bigotry in this talk, particularly racism, particularly Islamophobia, and I will be directly quoting from far-right online content. There are no slurs, and there is no explicitly violent language, but just as a heads up. Native British people are set to become a minority by 2066. It's not just these words that greet visitors to the main website of Patriotic Alternative, called the largest and most active fascist movement operating in the UK today by anti-extremism charity Hope Not Hate. Beside it is a countdown, ticking down to the very second native British people, by which they mean white British people, will allegedly be less than 50% of the UK's population. It's a bold assertion backed up with a message of urgency, an implied call to action before it's too late. This is just one example of how Patriotic Alternative, a group that combines street activism with seemingly wholesome activities like community bake sales, embraces and promotes the Great Replacement theory. This mainstay of modern far-right propaganda has been seen in milieux as extreme as the alleged manifestos of the white supremacist shooters in Christchurch in 2019 and Buffalo this year, but has also gained traction in mainstream spaces like Fox News in the USA and The Spectator in the UK. More than just warning of demographic change, the Great Replacement theory purports that white European populations are being replaced on an ethnic and cultural level through immigration and falling birth rates among white Europeans, and that this is a deliberate plan by politicians, the media, and nebulously defined globalists. It is in many ways not a new idea in the far right. Fears of racial mixing and miscegenation, of the imagined dangers of immigration, have long been at the hearts of these movements. American neo-Nazis have warned for decades of a similar white genocide, but this is usually explicitly anti-Semitic, saying it is a Jewish conspiracy. In Europe, the concept of Eurabia asserts Western countries are being brought under Islamic control and that multiculturalism is a threat to society. Just for clarity, while demographic change is happening in the West, its scale and extent are heavily debated. The idea of white people losing their enshrined place in society is a racist claim that has been invoked repeatedly over the centuries, and there is absolutely no evidence that any of this demographic change is happening because of intentionally anti-white agendas. What makes the Great Replacement theory stand out is the way it ties together strains of far-right ideology and anxiety. Immigration and the racialized other are rendered existential threats, endangering white bodies, population numbers, and even their culture and traditions. Blame is levelled at a vague global elite, which does leave room for the old anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, but also harnesses modern distrust in governments and politicians, corporations and CEOs, and mainstream mass media. But it is in falling white birth rates where GRT, I feel, shows itself a unifying theory. The ideology of the far right is defined not only by its racism and anti-Semitism, but its misogyny, homophobia, transphobia, asserting that the white race is under threat justifies restricting women to the domestic role of mothers and wives to protect families and raise white babies. It fuels anti-abortion rhetoric from the far right, or the mainstream right, if we take US Representative Mary Miller at her word when she said overturning Roe v. Wade is a, quote, victory for white life. It identifies white LGBTQ+ people as not only traitors to a white race who will not reproduce, but threats to a traditional society already in danger, and evidence of the bias and agenda of anti-white elites who allegedly favour them as much as they favour ethnic minorities. With the Great Replacement theory, everything the far right hates is an existential threat, and far-right groups use this as a call to arms to save the white race. For the past few months, I've been conducting a digital ethnography of Patriotic Alternative. I monitor their social media feeds, I watch their streams and video essays, I read the blog posts on their website. The focus of my research is women in the far right, but my methodology demands a holistic look at all of their digital content, so it has been impossible to miss the explicit and implicit presence of GRT in their propaganda. PA was founded in September 2019. Hope Not Hate have called it a fascist, anti-Semitic, white nationalist organisation. Their leader, Mark Collett, was formerly a leading figure in the BNP, while several of their members had connections to the now proscribed neo-Nazi group National Action. The political aims stated on their website include a complete halt to all immigration, the deportation of all illegal immigrants, and the voluntary repatriation of, quote, those of immigrant descent who have obtained British passports, end quote. Demographic replacement is one of the core messages of PA. In April 2022, they held Demographic Replacement Awareness Month of April drama, where regional groups competed to distribute the most leaflets warning of demographic replacement across UK households. I received one of these myself through my front door. The social media feeds of their leaders and members, these images are taken from Telegram, but the content is usually replicated on other platforms such as Gab, revel in every occasion the mainstream media, like Fox News, The Spectator, or the Daily Mail, even draws attention to demographic replacement and GRT. In late 2020, one of their activists called into an LBC show on which Keir Starmer was a guest and used the opportunity to voice GRT talking points, again citing the by 2066 argument. PA crowed about the activism among themselves, but also used the ensuing wider public discussion to push the idea harder and piggyback their own arguments and ideas. Sometimes the approach is simple. Anything that can be identified as demographic change is linked to GRT. See here, where PA leader Mark Collett suggests the number of black boys in the French under-17 football squad is evidence of replacement, or here, where he complains about diversity in marketing. Something that might have once displeased racists is now more than grounds to complain. It is evidence of existential threat. Even racist memes, the kind unfortunately common on far-right social media, take on a conspiratorial air, emphasising the notion that white people are being replaced and that it is deliberate. The far-right's misogyny becomes justified under the principles of GRT. There is no cost too high in this argument for protecting or raising white birth rates, even the rights of women. But it's often more subtle than that. It's harder for me to find pithy memes connecting the rights of women or LGBTQ+ people to the fall of the white race, and the connections are more commonly made in the stream's discussions I've followed and seen. Abortion is vilified as the murder of babies, but PA also enthuses about how its restriction will increase white birth rates. One PA supporter on Telegram clarified, "I'm only anti-abortion when it comes to white babies." Curbing white birth rates is also in this rhetoric, of course part of a malevolent plot by certain globalist Jewish groups. A lot of PA's homophobia and transphobia is the fairly common in far-right rhetoric railing against degeneracy in society. But sometimes there are further undertones, with one member's complaint about how society will let you champion pride but not champion so-called white culture, including, "Their ultimate goal is to have us cheer for our own genocide." Another strong thread is the condemnation of children being educated on LGBTQ+ matters in schools, complaining they don't need to be exposed to sexualized content. But this escalates. to asserting the state and media are pushing LGBTQ plus propaganda, and links to a common PA argument that the school curriculum is anti-white, teaching white children to hate themselves and their culture. This is subtly more than the usual think of the children moral panic long used to justify homophobia. They've made a boogeyman of the state and education system as enemies of so-called white culture. Then they make the championing of LGBTQ plus rights and anti-racism part of the same anti-white government agenda being inflicted on white children. Sometimes seemingly unrelated current affairs can be contorted by GRT logic. One blog article in June 2022 responded to reports of Tony Blair's suggestion that even more young people should go to university. This blog argued that an overeducated population would lack skilled labourers and that the country would need immigrants to fill the gap. But beyond that, it implied intention. It is indeed funny how all liberal views result in more immigration, though perhaps this shouldn't be a surprise. After all, if you no longer put your own people first or understand that your people will be skilled in different ways, then inevitably you will favour the outsider as a replacement. Here, an event that might hit the news, Tony Blair's opinion, which has nothing to do with immigration or changing racial demographics, becomes not just connected, but also evidence of conspiracy by authorities. The existential threat implied by GRT justifies any criticism of those with whom they disagree. Another blog article attacks critics of the Rwanda asylum plan, not because PA particularly like it, they largely believe it's a lie, but they can identify its opponents as enemies to be railed against. Here, even MPs speaking in Parliament against the deportation plan are not politicians participating in democracy, but part of an apocalyptic conspiracy. Quote, "They are utterly committed to advancing their anti-white replacement agenda by any method available to them. Characters and organisations that deserve to be brought to the attention of the public and exposed for what they are. Collaborators in a campaign of ethnic cleansing and processors of anti-democratic strategies aimed at silencing your children's screams even as they are being groomed by groups of predominantly Muslim men and putting an end to their inheritance of this, their rightful homeland." GRT thus doesn't just mobilise racism in the far right. It's a conspiracy theory that creates an existential threat, with the white race at risk of deliberate genocide, physically and culturally. Ethnic minorities, LGBTQ plus people, and progressive politicians in this narrative are the enemy, but so are all governments, the mass media, and global elites, who are believed to be deliberately orchestrating white eradication. It gives occasionally disparate facets of far-right ideology cohesion, tying together threads of homophobia, anti-Semitism, anti-immigration, anti-elite, and so on. These are then intensified by the sheer apocalyptic scale of the danger. With GRT, everything the far right already hates is connected, everything is about the fate of the white race, and everything is an implied call to action. As this rhetoric is already present in the mainstream, it is important that we learn to recognise it, and essential that we begin and continue to challenge it. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Kath. That was absolutely excellent. What's intriguing me is seeing the connections between the papers. And if anybody else noticed that the Oxford University professor was on that leaflet just to talk about the nature of authority and calls upon authority. So now we turn over to Adam's paper. I'm just trying to get this up here and now. And the traditional wait for PowerPoint to come through. So Adam is going to discuss Beyond the Usual Suspects, Populist Myths, and say it.
Kaiser Soze.
This is why we need experts.
Thanks, Amanda. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Adam DINSMORE. I'm a first year PhD student here at the York Sociology Department. As Amanda just said, my presentation is titled Beyond the Usual Suspects, Populist Myths, and Kaiser Soze Elites, and I will explain the title in just a moment. I'm going to be talking about the central myth that animates populist discourses, and particularly about a disconnect that exists between the way populism is theorised and the way it's measured by researchers who are interested in populist attitudes at the individual level. And then I'll also give a couple of words about how I think practice and theory within populism studies can be better reconciled. So before beginning, I'll just mention that I'm a first year student, so I don't have any original data to present today. I'm basically presenting the core problem that my thesis studies are meant to address. My research interests are in populist discourse, and particularly in the discursive construction of the elite within populist discourse. My presentation is split into 3 parts. First, I'll explain what's meant by the Kaiser-Soze elite phenomenon. Then I'll talk a little bit about how populist actors construct the elite in populist discourses. And then I'll contrast that with how the field of populism studies tends to operationalize the elite when seeking to understand populist sentiment held by members of the public. So before I launch in, just to define a couple of terms. So throughout this presentation, when I mention populism, I'm referring to a form of political discourse constructed around a central myth that sees society as a perennial struggle between a virtuous people and an oppressive elite. When I talk about elite, I'm referring to small groups of people with disproportionate control of power, wealth, and decision-making in a given society. And by discourse, that's any I'm referring to any form of communication made up of relations between signifiers, which is a fancy way of saying political speeches, newspaper articles, memes, manifestos, etc. So, the name Kaiser-Soze comes from the 1995 film The Usual Suspects, which, without wanting to spoil the ending, features a mysterious villain named Kaiser-Soze, whose true identity is only revealed in the final moments of the film. The term Kaiser-Soze elite was coined by a social theorist named Paul de Guy, who's writing in a 2008 special edition of the Sociological Review titled Remembering Elites. And the edition implored the social sciences to take the study of elites seriously and alleged that certain disciplinary trends within the social scientists had meant that an emergent class of 21st century financial elites were poorly understood, and that this was partly the reason why the social sciences in the round failed to predict the 2007-2008 financial crash, which took place very shortly before the edition was published. So de Guy's essay in this collection, titled Kaiser-Soze Elites, concerned the way that academic and media discourses can combine to render certain elites less visible in the public imagination. And de Guy was concerned that this empirical under-description of financial elites would mean the 2008 crash would be redefined as a political problem, and with democratic states and their tax revenues having to foot the bill, bailing out the financial elites who had in fact caused the crash. He also predicted that if this was allowed to happen, we would see a rise in populist politics in the subsequent years. And indeed, there is some evidence that de Guy's predictions were correct. 2010s did indeed see populists elected to executive office in some of the world's largest democracies, and also a steady rise in the number of votes cast in European parliamentary elections, as shown with this graph, which is a common collaboration between the Guardian newspaper and the University of Amsterdam, which shows that from around the turn of the millennium, the number of votes being cast for populists rose markedly across Europe, with most of that rise going towards movements on the far right. So naturally, this prompted a marked increase in scholarly attention for populism, with researchers seeking to understand both the content of populist attitudes and also the social determinants of them. And as one might expect, a lot of this work has focused on far-right movements in Western Europe and the US. However, it is important to remember that populism is not a 21st century phenomenon, and it's not just a transatlantic phenomenon. The first explicitly populist movements are usually taken to have been the Narodniks in Tsarist Russia, and the US People's Party, who actually coined the term populist, not initially as a pejorative, both of which emerged in the late 19th century. Since then, every continent has seen a wide range of populist movements, ranging from the political left to the political right, sometimes as vehicles for progressive projects, sometimes for reactionary projects. And it's important to note that no two populisms are exactly alike. They're always constructed discursively to fit the historical and local conditions in which they emerge. So given that populism has emerged again and again in a range of different places, usually at times of economic crisis and or hegemonic breakdown, it's important to understand what distinguishes different flavours of populism. And it's important that our methods for studying populism aren't biased towards one particular type over another. So with that scene setting out of the way, I can now unpack a little bit what I meant earlier when I said that populism is primarily a discursive phenomenon. It's basically another way of saying that different populisms can be distinguished by the way in which their central myth is constructed, particularly via the way that populist actors choose to construct the people and the elite. So to give an admittedly reductive but hopefully illustrative example, I'll here present a side-by-side comparison of the signifiers used by two recent populist movements, which I hope you're all familiar with, including the signifiers they use to represent the people and the elite. In both cases, the dichotomy between the people and the elite is clear, but it's articulated very differently. This slide does get a little busy towards the end, so forgive me if it causes any headaches. The first one is the Occupy movement, the Occupy Wall Street movement, which is situated on the political left and is considered an inclusionary populism by theorists. The people is the 99%, the elite is the hyper-wealthy. The people is defined in an intentionally vague way with low barriers to entry that invites people to join the movement. That's why it's termed an inclusionary populism by theorists. While the elite is described more or less specifically as the hyper-wealthy people in the top strata of economic capital. The contra-example to that is Trumpism, which is considered an exclusionary right-wing populism and constructs the people and the elite in the polar opposite way. The people is defined specifically in terms of nationality, ethnicity, immigration status. You can't join the people in Trumpism, you have to be born into it. While the elite are left somewhat vague, which, as Kath was discussing, does allow some movements of this type to couch racist dog whistles within the elite discourses that they advance. Discourse analyses tend to show that Trump, at least in the manifest content of his discourses, most often takes aims at politicians, liberals and experts. In both cases, the character of the populism is determined by these choices of signifier, determining who can join and what the goals of the movement are. So, given that populism can appear in such radically different forms, and given that the forms are in large part determined by the way that the elite are constructed within the given movement's central myth, it would seem to be crucial that our methods for measuring populist attitudes be agnostic about who actually constitutes the elite. But when we take a look at the scales that have been developed in the last decade for that purpose, time and again we see examples like this. So this is taken from a battery of questions that was used in a study by Van Harvert and Van Kessel, which was a cross-national study of populist attitudes. I believe this was conducted in the Netherlands. And you'll see the populist part of the survey that they presented to their participants. It has 8 questions that gauge populist sentiment held by participants. Each question, the questions frequently mention the elite and the people, because that's kind of what populism is constituted of. But every question tells the participant who the elite is. The researchers effectively, in the same way the populists do, are discursively constructing an image of the elite in the minds of their participants, in this case favouring politicians. So if we think back to our Occupy Trump comparisons, it seems obvious that these scales will skew in favour of right-wing, anti-political populisms, and indeed the field has been criticised on these grounds in recent years. When we go beyond that one study and look across the whole field, so the table on the right of the screen features the results of a content analysis that I've done of the 15 most used populist attitude scales in the last 10 years. And listed against the scales are the way that the elites are signified within that, and then the word cloud just kind of recapitulates the data here. And so you'll see it's a little more pluralistic, but politicians still dominate alongside other signifiers like experts, business, corporations. But crucially, none of the scales reviewed are agnostic about who the elite are. All of them construct the elite on behalf of respondents in some way or another. Again, we should expect these scales to display poor comparability between different geographical contexts with different elite configurations, and that is what statistical reviews of their efficacy have tended to show. The predominance of political markers used to signify the elite may express more about the ideological priors of the researchers who constructed the scales than the attitude held by the respondents. And as I mentioned earlier, this represents a marked disconnect with over a century of social theory about elites. This table is an incomprehensive summary of elite theory, social theory about elites, which can be represented as containing 3 major stages. The first was the early stage when theorists such as Marx, Pareto and Gramsci debated whether elite status was primarily determined through access to economic, political or cultural power. The second, taking place around the middle of the 20th century, kind of at the height of the Cold War, concerned debates about how unified or competitive actual elite configurations tended to be in practice. And the third, over the last few decades, represents a synthesis of these earlier 2 stages, where theorists more and more came to recognise that real elite configurations are historically contingent and may manifest in a variety of different overlapping forms. So populism studies would do well to reconnect with this body of theory to avoid the transhistorical treatment of elites that we've seen in the last couple of slides and go beyond assumptions that elites are always political actors. And there are examples of methods that can do this outside of populism studies, and in fact this example comes from outside of academia. This is a poll that was conducted by YouGov in 2019, the results of which, it presented a typology of different elite types to the British public. And the results suggested that the British public consistently recognised the existence of around 4 distinguishable elite groups at the top of British society, with some interesting differences between centre-left and centre-right voters. So this kind of typological approach represents one option for how populism studies could better capture the real nature of elites, but it still relies on prescribing the choice of elite signifier to participants, which is always going to be problematic, analytically problematic, because actual elite configurations are constantly in flux. As we can see from this diagram, taken from Anthony Sampson's longitudinal study of Britain's ruling classes, which was conducted between 1962 and 2004, this is another messy slide, and I won't go through every circle here, but basically, in each diagram, each circle represents a centre of power within British society in the year that the survey was conducted. And the general trend over the 50 or so years that he conducted these surveys, there were 6 steps to it, but I've got the first and last waves of the survey here, is that British power has become less pluralistic over time, so there are fewer significant power centres, and we've actually seen a ceding of political power as Parliament has gotten less influential, the civil service has gotten less influential, and cultural and economic figures such as the rich and the media have swelled to fill those deficits. Which suggests that it's dubious to continue to survey publics as if politicians are the only form of elite and therefore the only viable target of populist opposition. It therefore seems the only way to accurately capture who the public have in mind, given that elite configurations are constantly in flux, when thinking about elites, is to ask them who they're thinking about when we survey them. So in summary, I would recommend inverting the methods we use for measuring anti-elite attitudes, replacing the current prescribed schemas with methods which ask publics to tell us about who they have in mind before they indicate their feelings about elites. And in summary, much recent populism research overlooks the constructed mythic nature of the elite within populist discourses. This is likely to prime participants to think of the elite in ways which reflect the ideological priors of researchers, and methods should be re-theorized to better reflect how publics actually conceive of the elite, and that's what I'm hoping my thesis studies will make a contribution to.
Thank you very much for that, Adam. That was an absolutely fascinating discussion. And again, I particularly like the way in which you were opening up that notion of the elite towards the end of that there, so that we can start thinking about the powerful in this context as well as just the elite. So now we turn to another colleague from Manchester Metropolitan University, Hannah Guy, who is going to talk to us about visual disinformation and the spreading of Islamophobia. Thank you, Hannah.
Hello, so I'm a PhD student at Manchester Metropolitan University. My thesis examines the role of images in the spread of disinformation on social media through a case study of the Westminster Bridge photograph. I'll start with some sort of rationale behind why I've decided to examine images. Disinformation is become a very interesting topic for all different kinds of researchers to examine. It's a very contemporary issue. There's a lot of research interest. But like social media research in general, images are often overlooked when examining social media, but this is despite images being a very important communication tool on social media, and photographs in particular have a long history and association with evidence and truth value and objectivity, but they sort of used in the media, in the police, to evidence that something happened. Photographs are used to see into a scene that you weren't physically present at, so they can be powerful at conveying information. But the issue is that photographs show, but they do not tell. Unless you know about what the photograph is, where it was taken, why it was taken, it's difficult to understand what a photograph shows and what it means. So often we rely on the context surrounding a photograph to understand those things. So this can potentially make photographs very powerful tools for manipulation if you manipulate the context in which a photograph is presented. So this is why I think that photographs in particular need examination in the context of disinformation research. And also my research uses a methodology that isn't really typical of disinformation research. It deeply examines a single case of a prominent piece of visual disinformation and sort of follows its journey across the media. So I'll talk about my case today. So on the 22nd of March 2017, there was a terrorist attack on Westminster Bridge in London, and a press photographer was present during the attack and began taking photographs immediately after the attack happened. And one of those photographs was this photograph, which some people might recognise. It was a series of several photographs of this woman walking past people sort of tending to an injured person who was injured during the attack. Because it was a press photograph, it ended up on a New York Daily News article as part of like a slide of photographs showing that the attack happened. But from being in the news, it then moved to social media, specifically Twitter. And this tweet in particular went viral. Based on what the tweet shows, based on the account, you could see that the owner, Texas Lone Star of the account, looks to be an American, a Texan person, cowboy. When you look on the account description has like hashtag pro-Trump, hashtag Trump 2016, and he captioned the photograph with "Muslim woman pays no mind to terrorist attack, casually walks past a dying man while checking phone, hashtag pray for London, Westminster, ban Islam." So he's sort of contributing to the discourse around the attack, but sort of manipulating what the photograph shows, because the photograph on its own, it's very, unless you know about the attack, it's very difficult to know what the photograph shows. But this person is presenting it in a way to suggest that the woman, because she is Muslim, is purposefully ignoring someone who is dying behind her. We don't know that person's dying, but this is how the photograph has been manipulated. And then from there, because it went so viral, it ended up in the UK mainstream press. There were several articles published about the photograph, generally citing this tweet. There were other tweets that also shared the photographs of this sort of narrative, but most of the press worked to undermine what the person was saying, calling them a monster, etc. But this is probably, if you do recognise this photograph, where you saw the photograph in the news, because there were so many articles published about it. So it sort of spread across the hybrid media system of social media and the mainstream news media. But in November, Twitter purged a load of disinformation accounts, and it came out that Texas Lone Star was a Russian disinformation account. It was a made-up personality specifically designed to spread disinformation. And the Russian company that does this, the Internet Research Agency, specifically spreads and engages in online influence operations for the benefit of Russian politics, Russian oligarchs, etc. So a couple of questions that I had about the journey of the photograph. What was the role of the photograph? Why did it? Was it the photograph that made it spread so widely? What was the purpose of using the photograph? What was the role of social media and the news media in the photograph spreading across the media? And also, kind of tying those two together, how did the photograph become so prominent? So I'll quickly talk about my methodological approach because South Lone Star, Texas Lone Star was identified as a Russian disinformation account. The entire account has been deleted. So I sort of had to adapt this methodological approach to fill in this data black hole as much as possible, identify different areas of the internet to find information about the tweet. So for example, the wider context, the attack, other users who shared the photograph, people who replied to South Lone Star's tweet, all the news articles about the attack, how they spread on Twitter, the comments on those news articles, and as well, I also conducted focus groups with British Muslim women. And just quickly, just a quick data breakdown. I used an online social media scraping tool to collect relevant tweets and online news articles. So I sampled, it was a big data set, so I sampled the most retweeted tweets and used visual content analysis, thematic analysis and semiotic analysis. Similarly on the online news data as well from the articles about the attack that were published in March and November, not about the attack, about the photograph, that were published in March and November, and as well focus groups with British Muslim women, which I don't have time to talk So in terms of the findings that I produced, the key findings, firstly, the signs, this was based on a semiotic analysis, the signs within the photograph work to separate the Muslim woman in the photograph, isolating her and making her behaviour seem unusual. If we look at the photograph again, the woman is separated in a variety of different ways. She's walking away from the scene behind her, she's separated from the scene behind her, she's not looking at the scene, everyone else behind her is looking at the person on the ground, she's looking at her mobile phone. She's also the only visibly non-white person in the photograph, she's veiled as well. And as well, post 9/11, negative media stereotypes about Muslims are prominent in the UK press. They're represented as terrorists, as terrorist sympathisers, Muslim women in particular, as barriers to progression. And this photograph and the tweet also spread immediately after the Brexit referendum results in 2016, which were where we become used to these anti-immigration, anti-refugee narratives, these sort of right-wing populist ideas of why we should leave the EU. And then so there's this idea that people are used to seeing Muslim women in particular represented as like a racialised other within society. And then so it's these sort of separations within the photograph that were mobilised by South Lone Star in order to present this like manipulated interpretation of the image. As well, I also looked at other Twitter users who shared the photograph as disinformation, and that those that generally did not manipulate the photograph's content, but its context, similar to what South Lone Star did. So I've got some examples here. And all in all of the tweets that I analysed, 64% of tweets did this, either by captioning it with the tweet text or just adding text to the photograph. And these all have similar sort of narratives and ideas around like othering, the racialised other, the woman doesn't care, etc., etc. So in these instances, it's the photograph sort of functions as evidence of the manipulated claim, the manipulated Islamophobic claim that the users are putting forward, and also it's very quick and low tech. The photo hasn't been photoshopped. Anyone can do this sort of thing. There's lots of talks around like deepfakes and things like that in the context of disinformation. But it's my opinion that deepfakes at the moment aren't really very dangerous. The only examples of deepfakes that exist are sort of for comedic effect or to show the technological abilities of deepfakes, whereas more commonly it's these low-tech, quick types of visual manipulation that are being spread on social media. Also, the Twitter replies to South Lone Star's tweet were very intense, negative and quick. This is all mentions of South Lone Star on Twitter in 2017. The account was deleted around the end of May, which is why the interactions sort of dip off. But it's that big one on the 23rd of March, which was over 8,000 replies to the tweet. So there was this strong opposition to the tweet, and a lot of the replies that I analysed were in opposition to what he was saying, not in support of it. And then finally, in terms of the online news coverage, again, the news media reported very heavily on the tweet in March. I would argue that that's an example of news amplification. It doesn't really, I don't think it warrants that many news articles about a tweet. Yes, it was about a very topical event, but there was this big interest in the media around a tweet. And then there's the reporting in November as well of when it all came out who South Lone Star was, all these Twitter accounts linked to Russian disinformation accounts. And you'll notice that the coverage in November is a lot less, which I think is interesting as well. And I think all this, I'm really interested in the idea of the media's role in disinformation, because there's increasing examples of something going viral, the news media reporting on it, and then thinking about what these consequences are, because I don't think that's really in the news media exactly. So in terms of the conclusions, in answering the questions, so as I said at the beginning, photographs are a common way of evidencing things. It's a way of, as if you were at the event, seeing through the photograph into the event itself. So using a real, unaltered photograph placed in a manipulated context through the captioning can be a powerful tool of persuasion, because people are used to seeing claims being evidenced by photographs. And again, there's also the negative stereotyping around Muslim women that have become commonplace in the media, and that's what South Lone Star's claim was echoing. So it's not like it was something new that nobody had ever heard of before. People used to be exposed to these kind of narratives in sort of this post-Brexit, like right-wing populist narratives in the media. So in terms of the role of social media and the news media, I would argue that social media works to amplify the tweet. Social media is designed to keep people engaging all the time in content through algorithms. That's how the architecture of Twitter and works, the communication structure of Twitter, to keep people on consuming content. So it's people themselves spreading disinformation through Twitter, engaging with these tweets, even if it's to debunk them, because all around interactivity exposes it to more people, increases audience size, and eventually gain news media attention. And that's the example of this here in this case today. In terms of the news media, on the surface, it worked to debunk, or try to debunk what South Lone Star was claiming the photograph to show. But again, that's a complex question. Did it actually do that? Did people just receive the original messaging? Wider research is very conflicted of the consequences of news media reporting on disinformation. And people's relationships with the media is very complicated. There's all issues around trust, people's different opinions, people's beliefs, etc. So I don't think it's as simple as because the news media worked to debunk it, then it just erased it from existing. So I think that's something that needs the examination, the effects and consequences of the news media reporting on disinformation. And then, how did the photograph become so prominent? In observing the journey of the photograph, it wasn't just one thing, it was a snowballing effect of different things. It was shared at an opportune time after the attack. There are signs within the photograph which work to isolate the woman, which can then support the manipulated narrative, the way the users responded to the photograph. So it's kind of like this snowballing effect until it became a piece of news in and of itself. And again, it perpetuated existing harmful stereotypes about Muslim women in order to manipulate and persuade people that this is how Muslim people respond to terrorist attacks. Again, people sort of used to being exposed to these kind of narratives in the media. And finally, and this was sort of reflecting on the themes of the conference, disinformation is often treated like it's this sort of new phenomenon that's come out of nowhere. But this idea of manipulating people isn't a new thing. Things have existed for a long time in order to manipulate people. Things like rumour, conspiracy theory, propaganda, certain media techniques. So I think this idea of looking at disinformation ahistorically and contextless isn't the best way of addressing it. So I'd say this is an example of the same old, well-established tricks of manipulation and persuasion performed using new technological methods. Yeah, that's it.
Thanks very much for that, Hannah. And again, I think some really interesting parallels there with earlier papers, in particular the memory paper. So let me shut this down and finally, in this section of the conference, we have Rhiannon Griffith.
I was just admiring your Welsh face mask.
Diolch yn fawr iawn. Is there a way of getting this? It's a PowerPoint thing.
Yes.
Do you want
to? Oh yeah, don't worry.
You go ahead.
Thank you.
So I turn you over to Rhiannon, who is going to talk about the man, the myth, the legend, remembering Justice Pierre Pal, and war crimes in post-war Japan.
Thank you. Also, what an absolute joy to have my name pronounced properly.
It's no problem.
So, good afternoon, everyone. So, I'm going to be a little bit different today because I couldn't possibly have hoped to measure up to these wonderful talks. So, I've decided to quit my PhD, and today I'm going to become your tour guide. This is my famous 10-minute tour, and we are off to Tokyo, Japan, but with a wonderfully low carbon footprint. So, if I can get the nose one going, my tour has already messed up. Classic. Okay, So, you have been on an aeroplane for 15 hours, you're utterly knackered, it is 40 degrees outside, but you can't check into the hotel. So what do? You go get some culture. So you decide to go to the Yasukuni Shrine. Very, very beautiful place, very serene, very sacred, very Instagrammable, right in the centre of Tokyo. But it is still too hot. So your lovely tour guide, I tell you that there is a museum and that museums have air conditioning. This is how most people get to the museum. Beautiful old pre-colonial building called the Yushukan. 700 yen entrance fee, a little bit steep for the time, but it is a hidden gem. It's a fascinating place. In this glass building over here, there is a full-scale C56-31 steam train, which I can feel the excitement for. The sign does say under the train that this train was one of the Japanese campaigns in Thailand and Burma which brought infrastructure and wealth to areas that were previously unreachable. I mean, I definitely remember somewhere else reading that it's also known as the Death Railway. Don't know if you've seen Bridge on the River Kwai, but that's just details, ladies and gentlemen. In the next room, there is a display about the Nanking incident with heavy, heavy quotes. This is a skirmish that the Japanese army, they were bringing help and joy to the local Chinese city. But it is interesting that they miss out the thousands of people that were raped and killed. Welcome. So this museum, which is set in the peaceful, peaceful grounds of a Shinto shrine, it has a lot of information about the Asia-Pacific War that you weren't expecting. Or perhaps it would be more accurate to say there's a lot of lack of information on the Asia-Pacific War. So the museum also says at one point that the war started in 1931, when Chinese rebels blew up a very important Japanese railway link in Manchuria. I am lucky enough to have done a degree in history. And I'm pretty sure there was a formal investigation that found that actually it was probably a Japanese ruse. But I'm probably remembering it wrong. I graduated a very long time ago. This is a museum, and museums teach history, and history is truth. So the Yushukan air conditioning got a bit too much. So I'll take you back outside. Back in the courtyard, you first see a very emotional, beautiful bronze statue of a widow, a war widow, and her children. There's also a statue of a horse and a pigeon. A rescue boat. They're all commemorations for the sacrifices of the Japanese citizens and animals that were lost in many, many wars past. So we'll stop here, we'll have a bit of lunch, and we'll sit in front of my favourite place in this shrine. This is the monument to Dr. Pal. You can't see here from the photograph quite how big it is. So it's quite imposing and solemn. It's placed on a small raised square. Stands about, I don't even know how tall I am, 2.2 metres tall, 1.8 metres wide, and it is considerably larger. Him is considerably larger than the average individual. So it's a black and white photograph of Radha Binod Pal in what is clearly a judicial gown. His arms are crossed, his eyes are forward. It dominates the front of the slab. There are plaques and inscriptions, predominantly in Japanese, with information sheets in this little box over there, and fresh flowers. The sudden juxtaposition of a photograph in a space of stone and ritual is intriguing, to say the least, if you're a nerd like me. So, if you step back from the stone, however, you really, really are kind of dwarfed by its air of authority. He's a powerful older man. His costume is a relatively universal symbol of authority. It seems like an official gravestone. It really does have an air of legitimacy. The monument and he himself feels irreproachable. There is also very little room for the visitor to participate, but rather they must observe and have knowledge imparted upon them, much like this talk. But I realise now I am a truly terrible tour guide. I haven't given you any of the context. So I'll pretend that my typo here with the dates was on purpose, that highlights the messy nature of history. So some scholars say it was 1931. 1937 is generally more accepted, which was the year that the Japanese Empire officially invaded Manchuria in China. So after the war ended in 1945, World War II, the victors held huge international tribunals. You've probably heard of Nuremberg, and you might have heard of the trials in Tokyo, Japan. So at the Tokyo trial, which this photo is of the defendants, 28 Japanese men were indicted, charged with crimes against peace, crimes against humanity, and conventional war crimes, which is the legal term. I'm not saying, just conventional war crimes. I've always found that quite amusing. Anyway, so at this trial, there were 11 judges from 11 different nations, which is very unusual for these kinds of trials. 2 of these nations, India and the Philippines, were very hastily added on before the trial started. I can't help but wonder if it was partly so that people maybe wouldn't notice the slightly more distasteful image of white imperialists prosecuting Asian imperialists. But Dr. Pal was the representative sent by India. So let's snap back to the memorial. So Pal himself was highly respected. He was born under the reign of the Empress of India, by which I mean Queen Victoria, and the British Empire. Pal was at various times, as detailed here, an academic, a legal advisor, and a High Court judge. He's quite often referred to as the only expert in international law on the bench at the Tokyo trial. But considering his experience in international law at the time is about the same that I have now, I would very much take that with a grain of salt. He did eventually serve as president of the International Law Commission, and he was even awarded the Order of the Sacred Treasure, first class, for his services to the Japanese state. However, we are not really interested in who he is, are we? We are interested in who people say he was. So Pal became very famous after the war. He's not particularly famous now in Japan, but there are at least 2 memorials and a number of buildings named after him in Japan. It's a practice which is highly unusual. They like to promote Japanese celebrities, is the very broad way of putting it. So it's really surprising when you see his name everywhere. But why, I hear you ask? Well, this is why. So at the Tokyo trial, as a judge, he submitted a dissenting opinion of around 250,000 words long. I bring this with me so you can see how ridiculously big it is, even if you don't know what a dissenting opinion is. So these opinions are made to highlight inconsistencies, inaccuracies, disagreements. They are quite honestly the spiciest part of any court ruling. I love reading them. So normally that's where a judge will explain why they think the majority is wrong. But this is ridiculous, frankly. The opinion was also extremely critical of the Allied powers, the Tokyo trial, and the blatant hypocrisy of states like the US and Britain, the Netherlands, putting Japanese imperialism on trial. He argued, as many have since, that the Tokyo trial relied on ex post facto law, i.e. the idea of retroactively criminalising something, where he was referring to crimes against peace. It is a lot more complicated than that, but that's kind of that's a one-line summary of this thing. So he argued that because of this, the trial itself is illegitimate. There were war crimes, yes, but the trial was victor's justice and therefore couldn't take place legitimacy. So before I finish off though, let's go back and do some mythologizing. So this quote here, you see the Japanese version on the right, it's repeated all over the place, all over the museum, all over the monument. When time shall have softened passion and prejudice, when reason shall have stripped the mask from misrepresentation, then justice, holding evenly her scales, will require much of past censure and praise to change places. I don't know about you, but I genuinely get emotional when I read that. I think it's, don't laugh, it's a really beautiful sentiment, this idea that what we value in society changes, that what we decide is wrong one year, we realise how awful and backward we were the next. They love attributing this quote to Pal. He wrote it in his dissenting opinion. But really, the quote should be attributed to Jefferson Davis, the President of the Confederate States of America, during the American Civil War of the 19th century. Kath's face is really putting me off. A man whose own statues have been removed due to his connection to slavery and white supremacy. Now, the irony of this is either ignored or not noticed. But of course, this inscription is not referring to the defeat of the Confederacy, rather the results of the Tokyo trials, and it is here, finally, that we know what is truly being memorialised. There are three key claims across this monument and the museum. 1. Dr. Pal was the only judge specialising in international law. Sort of true. 2. The Tokyo trials were illegal. A lie, but has strong merits. 3. That Pal declared all defendants as not guilty. Technically true, but extremely out of context. The English text has a slight variation on one point, not using the word illegal, but rather talking about the trial as formalised vengeance, something which I think is pretty fair. And so truth is mixed with lies, remembrance mixed with purposeful forgetting. And to misquote the great intellectual thinker Galadriel, history becomes myth and myth becomes legend. Now, I don't have a huge amount of time left, so I will leave you with this. So Pal is somewhat of a legendary figure still in Japan, primarily among nationalist historians and politicians. You may recognise the late Abe Shinzo on the left, who was a great fan of Pal and went to visit his son while in India. Pal has been attributed for being one of the reasons why there's so much strong connections now between India and Japan. And my favourite lad, Tanaka Masaki, was a revisionist historian who, even though the book has nothing to do with Pal, he has a photo of himself with the memorial, and he even wrote him a little poem, which I think is quite cute. He is an awful human being, though, so, you know, just remember that. In fact, his book is called, I'll leave on this, What Really Happened in Nanking, The Refutation of a Common Myth. Which I feel, like how we all talk about myths, but really, whose myths are being privileged? Why is one myth more easily debunked than the other? And this is something that this monument really brings out for me. Pal offers something utterly invaluable to those who deny wrongdoing. He's a respected intellectual, he's not Japanese, and he's dead, which means they have no control over how his legacy is used. So I will end the tour the way that all good tours should end. No answers, more questions, and an overwhelming desire to have a nap. Thank you.
Diolch yn fawr, Rhiannon. We're at the end of the time allotted for this session, but we started kind of late. So is it all right if I go to 1:30 for questions? Yeah? Yeah? Because I'm sure there's going to be questions, because, again, a lovely presentation full of myth nomads and myth perceptions. She said, just slurring her English because we've been speaking Welsh. So, questions?
Yes, my question is for Hannah. Thank you for your presentation. So when you counted the tweets, or like the comments in the tweets of pro or like, against, some of them would have even retweeted and said something either pro or against. How do you deal with ones that they just retweeted? And I'm doing the same thing with my data, and I don't have neutral. I'm going with agency kind of theory that if you retweet it without saying anything, that is a proposition from an agency theory. Do you have neutral, or are you recounting them the same?
Well, because the original tweet was limited. I couldn't collect retweets, and I wouldn't be able to tell. But in terms of determining, like, with the replies and other people that shared the photograph, some people just shared the photograph, sort of saying, like, this photograph speaks for itself, so you don't really know what they're trying to say. So I sort of had I think it was like Islamophobic, debunking, and unclear. So my like, and that was also present in the replies to the tweet as well. So yeah, I just had like an unclear intention of engaging with the photograph.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Richard.
Yes, thank you. So this is a question for Kath, and you kind of ended your talk by sort of mentioning links between the kind of discourses of the great replacement theory that you focused on in your talk and more mainstream accounts. Yeah, I just wondered if you could say a little bit more about the sort of the nature of those links and what you see in mainstream discourses. I mean, one thing that, one connection that I made during the talk, when you gave your talk, was with the kind of genre of kind of catastrophist writing that focuses on sort of ecological and civilizational collapse. There's a really great paper by Mitchell and Chowdhury in the Journal of International Relations, in which they kind of analyse this kind of literature, and which is sort of been produced in great quantity over the sort of last sort of 15, 20 years. And obviously, what they kind of point to is how the sort of fears about climate change and ecological decline and all the rest of it is kind of giving expression to an anxiety about whiteness. And I'm not saying this is consciously planned in the way that you're discussing the kind of theory. It's an unintended consequence of kind of economic systems and technological systems. But it's one connection that I could make, and I wondered whether that's something that you've thought about in terms of this area, or other connections that you've made as well. Thank you.
Well, connecting GRT to climate change is a little bit more difficult because actually generally those who report and support GRT are not particular believers in climate change. They tend to actually suggest that climate change is being driven by governments to justify further forms of social control of a government that they oppose. So that's a somewhat more difficult line. I would probably need to do a lot more reading and thinking to find those links to white anxiety. A lot of the mainstream evidencing of GRT is actually quite explicit. On the slides I have the polls finding that a majority of Republicans in the US believe that Democrats are intentionally trying to raise immigration to bring in more Democratic voters, and that sort of thing. So then that does vary. It can be subtle, and I think anything which starts to suggest now that demographic change or changes in society are a threat to sort of the current status quo and way of life in a way which is usually implied to be something in this country like white Anglo-Saxon heritage. Anything of that kind of gets a bit of extra heft to it, I feel, than it may have done historically. I mean, it's always been a talking point, it's always been a tool, but now these kind of additional connections, I think, have sort of codified and enhanced the rhetoric.
I wondered how much of that ties into the degeneration discourse of the 19th century. And that ties to the whole story about elites and replacement of elites as well. That was coming to my mind.
Like, none of it's really new is kind of thing with GRT. I think it just sort of makes explicit a lot of this stuff, because I find that with a lot of the far right, things like their homophobia, there are a lot of complicated sort of reasons of linking homophobia to whiteness and racism, and that's not the sort of thing which I think the average observer, even if they are homophobic and racist, is necessarily going to kind of comprehend their link. It might just be that they find, queer people icky, and they haven't necessarily rationalized it, sort of what this justification is. But GRT, I think, gives them like, this is undermining my way of life, and it gives them a kind of justification, something that they're already feeling. That's kind of what I'm seeing GRT as something a bit more different.
I'm conscious of time, we need to move to the next session, but we had one last question at the back there.
Yeah, my question was for Hannah, and I just noticed something, I think it was on debunk the misinformation. And I was wondering like if there was ever a role in like, I don't know if you're like, I'm sure you are, that you've seen like clickbait articles that feature on social media where the tagline associated with the article often has like very little to do with the actual article itself, and it appears a lot more controversial than if you look at the headline of the article and the actual article itself. Because I often find, probably because I have too much spare time, is that I look through the comments associated with kind of the advertised article, and you see that people are engaging with that controversial tagline rather than the article itself. And I wondered if there was any kind of like, any of that kind of disinformation that you found in kind of comment sections on clickbait articles.
Yeah, so yeah, what was interesting is when I analysed the comments on the articles, which not all the news sources have comments on their news sections, but it was mainly the Daily Mail and a couple of others. What was interesting in March, when the news articles were sort of saying this isn't very nice, most people were responsive to that. They were sort of saying, yeah, leave her alone, like she's just witnessed a terrorist attack, etc. It was the comments from articles in November when the news media was reporting saying this is an example of Russian disinformation, it was shared specifically to spread Islamophobia in the wake of a terrorist attack. It was only then when the news media was calling it disinformation or fake news or misinformation, comments were saying specifically, and again, bringing in the role of the photograph, but the photograph was real, how can it be disinformation? This isn't disinformation. So that's what I find interesting when I was thinking about the role of the media, because, and I think as well, people's understanding of what disinformation is, because the photograph was real and it hadn't been altered, they just thought, well no, this is real, it's not disinformation, I don't believe you, I don't trust what you're saying, F the Daily Mail, that sort of thing, which wasn't something I was expecting to find.
Yeah.
So I hope that answers your
No,
question.
thank you.
Yeah.
I'm tempted to have that as the theme for the conference there for Daily Mail.
It's only that on Top Gear, we just need somebody to talk about Richard Hammond.
So can you join with me, everybody, in thanking our 4 presenters for what was an incredible year. I believe we're going straight into session 4.